Our gospel reading today comes from Paul's letter to the Philippians, chapter 1, verses 3 through 6. I thank my God every time I think of you. In every prayer I utter, as I pray on your behalf, I rejoice at the way you have all continually helped promote the good news from the very first day. And I am sure of this much, that God, who has begun the good work in you, will carry it through to completion, right up to the day of Christ Jesus.
You'll have to bear with me. This is in my cursive handwriting, and sometimes I can't even read what I've written. But to be or not to be is the topic. And where do you begin? So you begin at the beginning. I was born September 6, 1941 in Utica, New York. My parents had come back to be with family from Florida. In 3 months, we were back in Florida, just in time for the attack on Pearl Harbor. The following years, we moved from place to place. I can remember at least 5 different places until my parents finally bought a house in North Miami, 12725 Northeast 125th Street. I don't know why I remember that, but it was numbers, and numbers I tend to remember. We were there for 5 years, 3rd through 7th grade. The last 3 years in a Catholic school. 4, I was baptized in the Catholic faith and sort of raised as a Catholic. My parents were not good churchgoers. Around when I was 7 or 8 years old, my father left. In 4th grade, I wasn't a good student and got into trouble at school, so my mother sent us to a Catholic school for grades 5th, 6th, and 7th. I did very well under the discipline of the Catholic nuns and was an A- student. My problem was math. I mention this because later in life, math is what I did best. Then I was 12 years old. We moved back to Utica. My mother got a job working for my uncle, which I believe was paying better than anything she could find in Florida. We moved into a 1-bedroom apartment above the restaurant where she worked and my uncle owned. So in 8th grade, I went to an integrated public school, my first contact with a black person. In Florida, everything was very separate. I vaguely remember a wall around the colors lit. There was no contact. And it didn't bother me. It was just another person. We never were good friends or anything, but we did have classes together. I did very well in 8th grade because it was, for the most part, a repeat of the 7th grade in Florida. Remember, I was going to a Catholic school. The only subject I really had to work at was the New York State history, having never lived there. I did manage to graduate as, what's first or second? Second is salutatorian, to the surprise of everyone, including myself. The only day I missed was the day of the class pictures. I had no coat to wear and did not want people to know we were that poor. Friends in the neighborhood for mostly were Polish background, and we lived in the Polish side of Utica, the west side. The east side was generally Irish. Utica at that time was worked by the Polish, owned by the Jewish, and governed by the Italians. It was called the Sin City of the East because everything was legal. One of my fondest memories is getting up on a stage with a female stripper and dancing with her. No stripping. Then came high school. I became the perfect student, did everything well with most subjects. I was an A student, but with a B plus. I got put into an English class for the gifted. Now that surprised me too. And I was 35 out of 35 kids. That is not a good place to be because I had always been towards the top of the class. I dated a couple different females, always upperclassmen, until I met Carolyn. She was a year younger than me. We went together for at least 3, maybe 4 years. I had fun at her house where we would play canasta. I know what the word is, I just can't turn the page. With as many as 10 people sometimes, but very often it was just us 4, she, her sister, her mother, and I. As a child, I had no close male friends and usually played with girls. Part of that was because in the neighborhood I lived in Florida especially, there were no males. It was entirely, all the kids in the neighborhood were girls. All right, I graduated from high school with no major happenings or regrets. I have gone back to class reunions, but there really was nothing there worth seeing. No one I was there I really wanted to see. I was accepted to Albany State College. I was going to be a high school math teacher. What a waste of time. Most of the courses I had to take were absolutely worthless. They decided that I had a speech impediment. So they sent me to a British speech therapist. Now, I still had a southern slight southern accent. I went there twice. And that's one of the reasons why I flunked out of college. So at the end of the second year, we parted ways. But there is where I met Helen, my future wife. She was part of the group that hung around together. I believe we had one date, sort of. Some of us went to a cabin, and I sort of got paired with her. In between my freshman and sophomore year, when I still thought I would teach, I decided I would go to a handicap camp for kids to see if I could teach handicap. I was 18, and the cabin I was assigned to was for 6, 7, and 8-year-old boys. What 18-year-old has the right to try to counsel 6, 7, and 8-year-old boys, even if they were disabled? I mean, I had one in a wheelchair who couldn't eat grapes because he might choke to death. I had one who cried all night. The only way I could get him to stop crying was to put him in bed with me. I had another one who liked to wet the bed because his punishment was a cold shower. This was not a good time, but it was the time I met Rick. He was an art teacher from the University of Georgia, Athens. It was my first real kiss with a male, and I began to realize where I never really fit anywhere and what group I literally should be a part of. I knew it was different, but up to that time I didn't know what that meant. So since I was no longer in college, I returned to Utica to live with my mother and sister. We lived in the 3rd floor of a house owned by my uncle. It was a huge place all filled with antiques because that's what he was. I got a job with Utica Mutual Insurance. Not a good situation, basically, but it gave me the freedom to become the gay guy. I went full-time ahead. I had affairs with lots of guys. One in particular was named Michael, and we were together maybe for a year and a half. He was a shoe salesman in a plaza near where I worked, and we would have lunch together. I wonder why no one ever figured that out. At least no one said anything. I soon became very aware to me that Utica was not where I needed to be. So one day I packed a trunk, a suitcase, and moved back to Florida. The trunk was shipped ahead. That's what I want to say. I still had that trunk until I moved to the Park Avenue address in 2018. I made a side strip on the way down to see Rick in Georgia for one only reason, and I'm doing ... By this time, he had a partner, so I was shipped off to a friend ... I lived in the YCM when I first got there. Whoa. From there, I learned where all the gay places were, and I became a very good customer of a number of them. There was also a gay beach where I spent most of my weekends. At that time, I was not allergic to the sun, thank God. What a wonderful memories. I got a job with a bank doing clerical work. This involved, with one hand, typing in the amount on the check and with the other hand throwing the check into a slot. This was how the amount was placed on the bottom of the check in those days. The job was from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., so it gave me lots of time to play in the afternoon, and I did. I finally moved into a one-room apartment in a boarding house. I soon discovered it was owned by a retired madam, and most of the females were also retired prostitutes. But I had a good time there. I often played cards with them when they needed someone. I made one really good friend. She told me her life story, and I just listened with awe without saying anything, making no comment. But since I was not in college, Uncle Sam caught up with me. The draft was going full blast, so I decided to enlist in the Air Force. Spent 5 years. This was in December of 1963. I was 22. Spent 6 months in Texas with basic and tech training. My first station was Homestead Air Force Base in southern Florida, about 15 minutes from Miami. I was home. And almost every weekend, that was where I was. I was a good little soldier, never got into trouble on base, even earning Airman of the Year. Surprise, surprise. No, I was really, obeyed all the rules and everything I was supposed to do. My next assignment was to Bermuda. What a great idea. I was there for 3 years. And even went back to college. The University of Virginia had classes there, and I took 2 economic classes to help. Well, wait a minute. I got to go back. Back when I was living in Utica, working at the Utica insurance company, I went back to college nights. And I started off taking math classes. I figured I'd finish my math degree. But one day I decided to walk into an accounting course. 2 weeks later, I knew what I was going to do with the rest of my life. And I did. I became an accountant. Actually, eventually a CPA. There one summer day, when I was at a cafeteria, and who should I meet but Helen? She was wearing a cap on her head to cover her hair. Well, one thing led to another, and I got her pregnant. Being in the service, I felt I only had one option, and that was to marry her. So we did. So I borrowed $500 from an uncle, And we were married in November 24th, 1966. David was born May 22, 1967. You figure the math. One time, our time there was that of a young couple just getting started. Only we were in Bermuda. I did come to love her in the early days. We were good at sharing and having fun. And we had some good times in Bermuda. Some great restaurants, found our own little beach. I got out of the Army in December 1969. We went to stay with her parents. And we had to stay the 5th year in Bermuda rather than the 4 in order for the service to send back all my family and goods and so forth. We returned to the States. Oh, while I was in the service, I never once flew military. I always flew commercial. So I have no idea what inside of a military plane looks like, even though I spent 5 years in the Air Force. We went back to her family place in Clyde, New York. From there, I went job hunting. First in Utica, nothing. Then to Rochester, where I got a job the same day. I went to work for a public accounting firm that specialized in car dealerships. When we got married, I told Helen I was gay and I would not do anything, my regulation, and I didn't. Helen found an apartment on Ellison Street on the northeast side of the city. At that time, it was mostly an Italian area. She went back to teaching, and her savings we saved to buy a house. David went to daycare, where we learned he was above average. Helen finally found a house in East Rochester that we could afford. She eventually had a job as an organist because she used to do that at her home church back in Clyde. It was at a combined Methodist Baptist church in Pittsford. Not a good inning. So we sort of decided that we need to go church shopping because we wanted David to have some kind of an education in Christianity. After going through Marriage Encounter, which was a very popular thing to do in those days, our prayer couple said we should try Mountain Rise. The minister at the time was Carl Johnson. So the first day we went, we had to break up in small groups and talk about, I don't remember, I was scared, petrified. We did join Mountain Rise 3/2/1975. And I know that because I still have the bulletin from that service. And back in those days, we got a certificate of membership and a personal letter from Carl welcoming us to the church, which I thought, looking back on it now, was kind of neat. If anyone wants to take a look at this, I'll share it with you later. Now, that's what I just said. I had the bulletin. We had found a new family, a faith family. We had great time here with the members, and most of our friends were revolved around this place. Living in East Rochester, my son was going to the public school in East Rochester. And in fourth grade, we found out that the teacher was using him as a teacher's aide because he would do the assignment in 1 minute and took the rest of the class half an hour to do. It was not a good idea. So we sent him to Harley for 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grades. When the tuition was like sending him to college, we realized we had to do something. So it was actually 10 years later that we had moved in the house. Helen found a house in Pittsford. It was closer to the church. Those were good years. I kept my promise not to act out in my gay feelings, and I was able to do that. Katie was born in 1979. She was the church baby. Most of you remember her. A lot of you remember her. I can't say most, but a lot of you do. I believe, now this is my belief, that this was Helen's attempt to keep the marriage going. And it did work for the next 16 years. And then came Jane Stevens, who got me involved as a volunteer with the United Way. And then Jean Golden, who got me involved with the local UCC Association and the conference. I actually became the treasurer of the conference for 2 years, full term. By the way, I was treasurer of this church. I was treasurer of the association. I was financial secretary, and I'm still financial secretary of the association. I became very involved in the UCC. I was asked to be a delegate to the General Synod in Ames, Iowa, held at the University of Iowa. As delegates, we were assigned one of the proposals coming before the body. Number 16 dealt with whether the UCC should become an open and affirming church. This was an issue I did not want to face, so God said, "Sorry, it's your assignment," and it was. That was the beginning of my coming out. It was not happening overnight. It was not an easy process for anybody. I was in love with Helen, and even to this day we are best of friends. One day I found myself hiding in the closet at home and not coming out. Co-workers came knocking, looking for me. I stayed in that closet. This was another coming out process. I realized I was so depressed. So off to a counselor I went. He also happened to be my primary physician, and that was not the best of ways to do things. So there is no repair, only acceptance. Shortly after this time, I moved out. Basically at Helen's request, and I thought it was a good idea. I found an apartment in Fairport, near to work, and I could afford it. We both went to counseling series and finally used meditation for the divorce. In the meantime, I was back going to gay bars. This is where I met Michael, 4/15/1997. He became the love of my life. He was funny and sexy. Later, I learned almost everything he said wasn't true, but I didn't care. To this day, I still take people at face value. Prove me wrong. "10 years, 3 months, 5 days later, he died. I found him dead in bed when I got home from work. He died sometime that morning. He had gone the previous day to have a cochlear implant, helping to help him hear. He was completely deaf in one ear, could only slightly hear in the other. When I left for work that day, he was snoring away. It took forever for the death certificate to become because an autopsy is required when someone dies at home. I started going back to bars to find ... Instead, I found true friendship with my age and younger. The group I'm now with, aged from 27 to 82, that being me, there are 7 of us. And Wednesdays and Fridays you'll find us together. Wednesdays at the Monroe Pub having dinner, and Fridays at Roar having drinks. We have become a family. So now I have 2 families, Mountain Rise and the Fellas, as we are called. And for the first time, I have a home that is mine. Almost all of my life, other people have decided where I live. First parents, then Helen, then Mike. Now, I had no problem with that. I thought the places we lived were great, but they weren't my choice. Mountain Park Avenue was the first time I can actually truly say I walked into a place and said, this is mine. So in my 82 years, I was able to be gay from ages 19 to 22, and then from 1995 to now. No regrets and lots of great memories. Thank you.